Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. A warm welcome and namaskar to all of you. So today we are again in the midst of another webinar for the Rammohun Roy 250 years celebration committee, which is called Reappraisal at 250. Today our topic is Rammohun Roy and the question in the Indian Monotheism. So we will have Professor Anutup Basu speaking on it and Professor Mou Banerjee as the discussant. And the meeting will be chaired by Pradip Datta, commonly known as P.K. So over to you, P.K.
Thanks, Amit Babu. Thank you very much for inviting me to chair this and for the privilege of that invitation on behalf of Rammohun Roy Reappraisal at 250 Society. Thank you very much to the Society. And great pleasure to welcome both Anustup and Mo. A quick introduction for Anustup. He is a professor of English, media, and cinema studies and criticism at Urbana-Champaign at Illinois. He's interested in film, philosophy, politics, and associated areas. He's been quite prolific as a writer. He's done a lot on film studies, Bollywood in the age of new media, then co-edited some volumes on intermedia and figurations in Indian films. But the one that is of immediate interest to us is, of course, his book, which is Hindutva as Political Monotheism, that came out in 2020 and highly acclaimed and much reviewed, a long durée study, genealogy of Hindutva and of political monotheism, which he calls it as a phenomenon of political monotheism. So, immense pleasure to welcome you, Anustup, and looking forward to your talk. Incidentally, he's working on Nehruvian cinema, which is again something fascinating, and we'll look forward to that because it's a study of Bengal and Bombay. Mo, I'd rather give in the introductions right now. She has been studying done her MA and her PhD at Harvard. Her book is now awaited. It's called The Disinherited Colonialism, Christianity, and Political Identity in India. It's forthcoming, 1813 to 1907. And basically, her interests at the moment are on religion and politics in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I should just quickly bracket myself in to just say that I have been teaching in Delhi University and JNU, and I recently retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So there we are, and on Anustup, you have about 45 minutes. And then Mo will get 15 minutes.
Unmute myself. Thank you, P.K. I would like to begin by thanking the committee, especially Tonika Sarkar and Amit Dash for inviting me here. In the spring of 2021, when the campaign for the West Bengal State Assembly elections was in full swing, the press noted a curious fact. The leaders of the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party were falling over themselves to pay homage to various icons of Bengal and claim their legacies. But there was an important name missing from that list. Despite holding rallies only a short distance away, BJP's national level leaders studiously avoided Raja Rammohun Roy's birthplace in Radhanagar and his ancestral home in Raghunatpur, both in the Hooghly district. On being questioned, the party spokespersons gave evasive replies. But a certain hard-right Hindu chauvinist response was quite clear and unambiguous in the wider mediaverse. A former Bollywood starlet tweeted that Rammohun Roy was a stooge of the British who had defamed the Shruti tradition. Quote, Shruti tradition was not compulsory, but was introduced to prevent the prostitution of Hindu wives at the hands of Mughal invaders. It was the woman's choice. Hashtag feminists of India, sati was not regressive, unquote. I begin with this anecdote because Rammohun Roy features in my book, which Pradip just talked about, Hindutva as Political Monotheism, which came out in late 2020. It is a genealogy of Hindu nationalism, and my scholarly interest in Rammohun has primarily been through this particular history of ideas. Otherwise, I'm not a historian by training, and I'm not a Rammohun specialist in any shape or form. Now, the question obviously arises as to whether I place Rammohun in that genealogical arc of Hindu nationalism. Not quite. I look at Rammohun as a sort of an inaugural moment in a wider, bigger Indian modernity project that, as we know, was multifaceted, faceted, many-armed, and flourished in many directions. Hindu nationalism as ideology and political phenomenon has been only one of its consequences. I will return to this point in a minute, but first, very briefly, let me state what I try to do in the book. I begin by drawing out a tacit monotheistic imperative in European organic theories of religious and ethnocentric nationhood. We know that the idea and imagination of a nation can be grounded on many different matters: race, language, culture, common histories, memories of migration, settlement, etc. Nationalism does not have to be based on religious identity. But if it does, then the religion itself must satisfy a tacit condition built into that model of nationalism itself. The religion has to be an Abrahamic monotheism, or there has to be a secular, cultural, or political equivalent of that. Theology of the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt. But it's not just Schmitt, it's pretty much consistently there. This assumption can be found in the annals of classical European political thought, both in the continental traditions and among the Anglican social contract theorists. So it is there in Hobbes's tirade against the religion of the Gentiles in the Leviathan, Locke's heartburn despite his famed liberty of conscience, or in Hegel's antipathy towards Jews, Anabaptists, and Quakers, despite his aspirations towards the universal. So, consider this passage in Rousseau's Social Contract. Quote, from the mere fact that God was set over every political society, it followed that there were as many gods as peoples. National divisions thus led to polytheism, and this gave rise to civil intolerance, which are
what happened?
Christological model.
I think you just have to be a little patient. It's got disconnected for some reason with the server.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Now we can.
Oh, okay. Because, I thought I was disconnected, but I wasn't.
And you just froze up. Your screen just froze.
Oh, okay. So it is therefore a broad Christological model that we can say was adopted by many European nations after the mid-millennial religious wars. So when the resolutely anti-Catholic thinker Carl Schmitt insists that all modern political concepts are secularized religious ones, what he means is that at the end of the day, Germany is Protestant Germany, England is Anglican England, and Spain, Catholic Spain. There are, of course, provincial limitations in Schmitt's thinking. I'll not get into that. The point, however, is that while India can be and has been imagined in many ways, what began in the 1920s with the birth of the RSS, writings broadly, was one imagination which bore striking similarities with Schmitt's proposal. Seen from that vantage point, the Oriental solution would be that for there to be a Hindu nation and a Hindu state, there had to be a Hindu monotheism or a secular ethno-cultural version of that. There had to be an axiomatic Hindu church and a sense of Hindu laity that could then be parlayed into the political construction of a national fraternity. This was not just a question of affirming faith in one God. There have always been strong monistic currents in the Vedic traditions and many theistic ones in the Bhakti movement. It had to be a jealous God, distinguished from false idols. And, I'm talking about Exodus 20. The religion had to furnish a strong eschatology and providential destiny energy, since a people cannot be people without a common journey towards redemption. The tendency to impart an Abrahamic cast to a vast eclectic field of polytheistic, pantheistic, henotheistic, mention of the Hindu as a religious and jealous political identity. The nationalist discourse in nationalist discourse, it meant finding a pan-Indian congregational principle to subsume caste divisions, religious eccentricities, gender segregations, and practices of untouchability. In terms of political theology, it meant compacting a pantheon of 330 million gods into axiomatic Hindu icons like Rama or Krishna, absorbing errant syncretic pieties and picturing a single Hindu telos, a destination. Finally, the project had to make this Hindu template politically indistinguishable from an Indian one. In importing this model to the Indian context have been, of course, witnessed and variously studied by all of us. We could begin with the term religion itself, that is, in a Latin etymological sense of relic, something that binds and relegates. Bimal Krishna Matilal has said that, quote, the social reality called religion did not exist in ancient or classical India. Religion, as Talal Asad has shown, was constructed as a modern anthropological category in the age of European secular introspection and the modern expansion of empire. So the giant spread of Indic pieties we identify as Hindu are thousands of years old, but Hinduism as a construct and category signifying a religion is recent. Secondly, Hinduism was not a congregational faith. The caste system foreclosed that. So if all Hindus could not enter the same temple, how could they gather in the same political assembly? Was the so-called Hinduism just a cover for Brahmanism? Could there be an axiomatic Hindu theology on the lines of Protestant Christianity, or do the scriptures...
I'm sorry to disturb you, Anustup. Can we switch off all microphones, please?
Because I have done
Thanks,
it.
sorry.
Yeah, I have done it.
So was the so-called Hinduism just a cover for Brahmanism? Could there be an axiomatic Hindu theology on the lines of Pauline Christianity? Or do the scriptures at melange of philosophical speculations mired in mythology and caste ethics? Can there be a Hindu identity without a Hindu equity? The colonial construction of Hinduism as a religion came with a set of Abrahamic expectations. The Hindus, to begin with, needed a book, and the book had to be a good one. It was perhaps with Charles Wilkins's 1780 earlier, the Warren Hastings administration, circa 1772, had adopted the Manusmriti as the axiomatic Hindu law over and above a dozen other dharmashastras. So with the epistemological and bureaucratic grounding of this religious anthropology during the long 19th century, the colonial state would invent a single Hindu community and imagine a homogeneous Muslim one in terms of demographics and political representation. It was an original polarization that what would be the differences between Rammohun's early 19th century project and Hindutva's 20th century one? Let me provide a couple of indications for now. Rammohun Roy wanted to abstract an actual religious monotheism from the Vedic compendium, primarily from the Vedas themselves, the Upanishads, and the Vedanta, but with a declared cosmopolitan vision that included Enlightenment reason, British liberalism, French republicanism, English literature, and the Baconian sciences. For Rammohun, it would be a lifelong project since the age of 16, backed by a polymathic education in the Persian Arabic, Greek Latin, Sanskrit, and Anglophone traditions. The construction of this monotheism called for liberal inspiration against the Trinitarianism of his day, as it was against the superstitious ritualism and idolatry of Brahmanism. It was about the austere and universal idea of God as one that is without attributes. The contemplation of the singular one could not be denied to any section of humanity. Those in forests, distant islands, on mountains, outside the pale and the great unwashed, unlettered, or untouchable masses, as Brahmanism would argue. Rammohun wanted this to be the basis of a civic religion that, in conjunction with modern science and jurisprudence, would instigate reform, inheritance rights for women, ending social superstition, idolatry, banning sati, Kulin polygamy, etc. The Hindutva ideology, on the other hand, is what I call a political monotheism. That is, by its own admission, an ethno-cultural formation that is almost entirely Orientalist and Eurocentric in its moorings. It is based, amongst other things, on an essentially James Mill version of Indian history, a post-Darwinian mid-19th century xenological thinking about race, a largely Herderian idea of organismic nationhood, Hindu, Hindustan, and all of that. So, something that is opposed to Indian federalism. And of course, Aryan enthusiasms and institutional models borrowed from European fascism of the 30s. The key point, however, is that this ideology of political monotheism, with all its contradictions, is designed to produce exactly what Rammohun's universal religion would categorically forbid: political jealousy towards the other as apostate or infidel. Here we could quickly remind ourselves that for V.D. Savarkar, it was Buddhism that could very well claim the universal and embrace all of humanity. His masculinist Hindus, meanwhile, could have their clear and present enemies. That apart, there's that other thing that Rammohun's idea of civic religiosity takes for granted, and which Hindutva, perhaps more than ever now, tries to destroy: liberal constitutionalism. So with these, excuse me, so with these distinctions made, let me turn to some features of Rammohun's work. I will begin with two early observations. The central impulse in Roy's intellectual project was about recasting a massive Vedic tradition as a modern monotheism. This, amongst other things, called for the sharpening of an editorial intelligence fit for the times. Fit for the times, but in the spirit of the great compiler and redactor, Vyasa, to whom tradition attributes the Mahabharata, the original text of the Vedanta, and indeed all the 18 major Puranas. The figure of Vyasa appears frequently in Rammohun's work as the one who divided the Vedic corpus into three, gave it a manageable form, synthesized all Vedic intelligence by cutting out confusing and contradictory passages. Rammohun refers to this figure in relation to his own work and his quite overt desire to earmark a canonical Hindu scriptural tradition and monotheistic essence, leaving out the ceremonial, the idolatrous, the irrational, and the mythic. At times, one gets the feeling that for Rammohun, the key figure that is missing in the Hindu fold is not the one equivalent to Christ, but that of St. Paul. As a result of this lack, Hinduism never developed into a vertically organized faith on the lines of Pauline Christianity, marked by great redaction, singular dissemination, apostolic succession, and the pastoral command of the congregational church. There was no Hindu institutional apparatus to set a singular narrative of redemption, to distinguish canonical truth from the Gnostic one, the true believer from the heretic, or to determine at every step the agama, or the perpetuation of God's will. In a melange of subcontinental histories, there was no temporal distinction to be made between the birth of true faith and the sway of the pagan. The entire body of Hindu wisdom had failed to furnish a sovereign scholasticism of holy catalogs and testimonies. That is, something like the construction of the New Testament in 27 books in over centuries, meticulously leaving out what was declared Gnostic or pagan. Endless. The tantras were endless, but all sritis, the tantras were endless, but all sritis, contradictory to the Vedas, dwelled in darkness. But which respected authority would tell and teach the people that? Secondly, for Rammohun, the modern installation of a Vedic monotheism was not just a process exegesis or logical abstraction. It had to be literary and anthropological. The project called for a prism of enlightened understanding by which one could comprehend the manifold eccentricities of Hindu custom, since apart from Brahman as one, all other millions of gods and goddesses are of the earth, imagined by mortals and put in place by their mythologies. The one has been and I use one with the capital O, obviously. The one has been symbolically comprehended as forces of nature, like the sun or the wind. But these myriad forms had to be understood as expressions of an abiding monotheism rather than was the translations of the lofty, enchanting style of the scriptures into a critical and disenchanted prose of the modern. This had to be literary because Vyas takes the supreme being beyond sensory or mental comprehension. The one can only be inferred by gestures of turning and pointing elsewhere through a reading of his creation in light, in the elements, or in time. The one created the void space, the emptiness from which the universe sprang, as well as human error and faith. This is also why there is no point quarreling with other religions, because they are all figural approximations of the singular truth that is always beyond rational calculation. Roy, therefore, in effect, creates a Vedic anthropology and announces the immense varieties of here and now Hinduism as study objects of that very anthropology. This anthropological stance is evident in the two tracts Rammohun wrote in 1817, briefly, a defense of Hindu theism and a second defense of the monotheistical system of the Vedas. Here he reads the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the laws of Manu in the spirit of modern logic and realism. He concludes that while the Hindu orthodoxy did overall endorse the worship of 330 million deities, this was merely an imaginative, quote, imaginative concession made to the limited faculties of the vulgar, with the view of remedying in some degree the misfortune of their being incapable of comprehending and adopting the spiritual worship of the true God, unquote. It has been in the interest of the Brahmins to encourage superstition and via the culture of idol worship, rituals and festivals, arrogate divinity and cash benefits to themselves. This was a conspiratorial Brahmin exclusivity, limiting the thoughts of the Brahman without attributes to their scholastic enclave, while foisting rituals and idols on the teeming vulgate as mental exercises. Quote, Rammohun says, quote, "Permit me in this instance to ask every Mussalman in Turkey and Arabia, from the highest to the lowest, every Protestant Christian, at least of Europe, and many followers of Kabir and Nanuk in India, do worship God without the assistance of consecrated objects. If so, how can we suppose that the human race is not capable of adoring the Supreme Being without the puerile practice of having recourse to visible objects?" Unquote. There is a moment in Roy's first defense that is especially remarkable in the light of the literary. He responds to a charge made by a learned Brahmin that his translation of sacred texts from Sanskrit to English are filled with inaccuracies and could breed public doubt. Roy declares that authorial intentions, even in quote, to being explained in different sense, unquote. The acts of interpretation and translation, therefore, could not be monolingual and authoritarian, controlled by the priestly class. Sanskrit, the language of the gods, could claim a renewed cosmopolitan valence only by reinventing itself. Democracy. Roy's was a literary exercise that therefore was deliberately internationalist and public, tending via a foreign tongue towards a world republic of letters. The literary here is also an admission of fallibility and finitude. It comes with the self-conscious knowledge that error is inevitable when one elaborates the one. For Roy, the question of doubt posed by the learned Brahmin, therefore, comes not from a concern about truth, but from the fear of losing absolute interpretive privileges. On the other hand, a belief in translation can be affirmed by the thought of a cosmopolitan mankind. Otherwise, quote, we must learn all the languages that are spoken by the different nations in the world to acquire knowledge of their histories and religions, or be content to know nothing of any country besides our own, unquote. Rammohun then proceeds to easily debunk another claim made by his interlocutor, that the Puranas prohibit the discussion of Sanskrit scriptures in other languages. An essential part of this new concept of the literary was thus to affirm a new eloquence of the vernacular. In his defenses, Rammohun severely criticizes the three dominant strains of Hindu worship in the Bengali Vaishnava, Shakta, and Tantra traditions, especially the human sacrifices, the use of wine, criminal intercourse, and licentious songs. So religion, in that case, becomes divorced from ethics and practical reason and reduces itself to fatalistic cycles of sacrifice, ritual, and pilgrimage. That apart, piety becomes antithetical to another novel category he introduces in the second defense, common sense. One story about Brahma, the creator, has him attempting rape on his own daughter. Another one about Vishnu, the protector, has him fraudulently violating the chastity of Brinda to kill her husband. Shiva, the destroyer, is seen to have a quote unquote criminal attachment to Mohini beyond all limits of decency. In that hall of infamy, a special place is reserved for Krishna, the unethical murderer of Putna, the debauched womanizer, and the cruel cuckolder. It was simply a matter of common sense to read these histories, these stories, either as parables or as mischievous interpolations. The stance of critical reading in a disenchanted prose of the modern, based on common sense and secular polemics, is of course also evidently on display in the series of tracts against the practice of sati, written roughly from 1818 onwards. They involved marshalling the Vedas, Manu, and Bhagavad Gita against so-called advocates of Shoti like Ongira, Vishnu, or Harita. We see forays into what we will call the domain of social psychology. Once again, based on common sense and practical experience, to dispel patriarchal myths that women are naturally prone to sensuous pleasures or are intellectually incapable of high spiritual contemplation. If the Shastras call for voluntary self-immolation, if all the Shotis mentioned in the Mahabharata, the wives of Dhritarashtra, Vasudeva, Balarama, or Pradyumna, willingly entered fire, then why is the contemporary widow buried and trapped in wood? What are the different shastric implications in each case when the choice of material in tying up the woman is between an iron chain and rope? Is that troublesome passage in the Vedas that votaries of sati regularly invoke at all genuine? If it is it prescriptive or allegorical? Is it actually instructing women to enter fire, or is it an allusion to the constellation in the moon's path, with butter implying the Milky Way, etc.? Why does even a relatively late legal commentary like Mitakshara clearly say that Shoti is the least virtuous act that a widow can perform? Rammohun's purpose in these pamphlets is to repeatedly demonstrate that ascetic living and contemplation of the divine has always been privileged in the Shastras over rituals. The ritualistic murder of women, apart from other things, thus deprives them of the chance to attain eternal beatitude. At the end of the day, however, Rammohun's clinching argument ushers in two other modern categories to go with common sense and reason: justice triumph over law and reason. Rather, there had to be a modern anthropological reckoning of custom that would connect the evil. There had to be a modern anthropological reckoning of custom that would connect the evil practice of Shoti with the question of depriving women of the right to property and the virtual sale of young girls into polygamy. Valorization of Shoti in line with Hindu idolatry destroys the texture of society, along with any compassion for fellow beings. This mode of literary thinking involves the scrupulous negation of earthbound gods as personifications of the one. The literary means absolving stories from the trap of the literal and setting them free as allegories of figuras, exemplary or otherwise. It is about rescuing figures and postulates from the prison house of dogma, making them enter into a relational play of contradictions, shock, and affirmations with each other. The Hindu religion can be abstracted as a Vedic monotheism only if the task of the literary is itself made universal by appealing to a natural religion that trumps all exclusive traditions based on. Towards the end of the first defense, Rammohun extends his project to Christ and Muhammad. None of them are personifications of God. They can be considered in line with an admirable doctrine he finds in Islam, but not in Christianity, personifications of the mercy of God. Rammohun similarly cannot condone Christian Trinity presence. He makes this amply clear in a later book called The Precepts of Christ. This is obviously a text that can be compared with the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth by Thomas Jefferson, completed in 1820, the same year Rammohun published his text. Precepts of Christ, much like Jefferson's deist exercise, is an effort to draw out the universal moral predicates from the Gospels, cutting out enchantment and magic. The text is built on the ethical premise that one does not have to believe in the divinity of Christ or the Holy Ghost to be a Christian. Christ must come to India without the baggage of miracles and magic, because the Indians had the Puranas, a Puranic baggage of their own. He must come as a figure of pure Unitarian ethics and harmonious, modernizing sensibility that Rammohun would call universal religion. Is it then desirable that Hindus should convert to Christianity? Well, asking this question, we should be reminded that Rammohun famously wanted Europeans to be allowed to buy property and settle down in India, in a cautious, calibrated manner, of course, with immigration in the first few decades limited to men of character, learning, and property. One of his major objectives in saying this was to ensure the continuity of Christianity, European science and education, and a liberal check on abuse of power, both priestly and political, in the South Asian context. That is, these things should continue even if the destinies of India and England were to part, as it happened with the United States. The presence of Christianity, along with Islam, the faith worlds of Nanak and Kabir, would be essential in the dialogic, ethical, and harmonizing project of transcending insular Brahmanism and restoring Vedic monotheism. But let's come back to the question. Does it mean that it is inevitable that Rammohun's Brahma project would logically culminate in Christianity? That is, after passing through the stages of natural religion and pantheism, as the Reverend K. Banerjee would put it, roughly 3 decades after Rammohun's death. We know that in letters written to individuals, to his former boss, John Digby, for instance, Rammohun often called Christianity the most advanced historical form of monotheistic faith. Not any Christianity, but the Unitarian form that was shorn of absurd and idolatrous practices of early Greek, Roman, and barbarian converts. But we also know that he repeatedly wrote tracts, letters, and pamphlets defending the Hindu religion against the attack of Christian missionaries. The writings published in the Brahmonical magazine in the early 1820s, or the debates in Bengal Hurkudu can be kept in mind here. He stated than the irrational mysteries of Christian Trinitarianism. Both were for weak minds. Rammohun also said that it was okay for missions to proselytize in lands like Turkey, where the British did not rule, but not in India, for that would be emulating the illiberal and inimical Muslim rulers. It is important to know that the canny comprador writings attacking Trinitarianism under pseudonyms like Shiv Prasad Sharma, Chandrasekhar Dev, Ram Das, etc. It was a precious double game. Rammohun, as Ram Das, writes, quote, Rammohun Roy's abandonment of Hindu doctrines cannot prove them to be erroneous, unquote. In a letter written in 1824 to the American theologian Henry Ware, on this exact same matter, Rammohun says that once one reaches the stage of contemplating the divine that is beyond language, reason, or identities, the question of conversion of Acts 10.35. Quote, in every nation, he that feareth God and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. That is, quote, in whatever form of worship he may have been taught to venerate the Almighty. Where, of course, had inquired about the practical possibilities of native conversion. As far as that was concerned, Rammohun states that a primary Hindu imagination of caste allowed proven cases of individuals opting to be Catholic for 6 months and Protestant for 6 months. To keep the natives Christians, the church should perhaps think of a monthly stipend of 8 rupees, or better still, where should So let me, at this point, try to move towards some sort of a conclusion. Despite founding the Brahmo Samaj as a universal Vedic church, Rammohun Roy was perhaps keenly aware of a few historical realities. One, there was an immense, variously vernacular, polyphonic, and polytheistic Hindu life world beyond Sanskritic Brahmanism, Latinate Christianity, or the Anglophone pedagogy of enlightenment. His intervention, accordingly, elite, esoteric, or idealistic as it might be, was bilingual, at times trilingual. Much to the chagrin of Orthodox Brahmins, it included publicly discussing Sanskrit scriptures in Bengali or translating the Gayatri Mantra into English. As his letter to Reverend Ware shows, if there had to be a true Indian monotheism, it had to approximate what Rammohun calls universal religion and not any denominational identity, even Christianity. Two, Hinduism did not have an axiomatic church and an editorial authority like Pauline Christianity. It would be fair to say that the universal Vedic monotheistic church of Brahmoism was a response to that, as was Rammohun's transcription of Sanskrit scriptures, using an irreverent Western secular apparatus of Enlightenment reason. He would marshal all his powers as a community leader and public intellectual to prevent Orthodox Brahmanism from emerging from its provincial enclaves and acquiring vertical public institutions of pedagogy and power along modern lines. This is quite clear in his letter to Lord Amherst in 1823, passionately protesting the setting up of a Sanskrit school in Calcutta. If the colonial government was interested in the education of native subjects, then the considerable allotted sum should be spent on instructing them in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences. The proposed seminary, on the other hand, would instill grammatical niceties and metaphysical conceits in the minds of the students, which would be of little or no practical value. It was precisely the kind of quote-unquote imaginary knowledge that had kept the country in darkness for centuries.
Anustup, I'm sorry to disturb you, but could you wrap up in a few minutes, please?
Yes, I'm almost there. Darkness for centuries. It should be noted in this regard that Rammohun, at every step, the ban on Shoti would be a special example, wanted the help of the liberal state apparatus and constitutionalism to that end. He, of course, repeatedly complained and lamented that the colonial state in India was not liberal enough and not activist enough. But Rammohun was Rammohun unambiguously preferred liberal rule, contra the intolerant militaristic rule of the Mughals, at least since Aurangzeb, or even the liberally inclined governance of Ranjit Singh, because he lacked constitutionalism. So today we seem to have come a full circle. There is a new age Brahmanism that has not only acquired vertical institutions, ecumenical, pedagogic, as well as political, but is on the path to conquering modern universities dedicated to the Baconian sciences or liberal arts. We know that story. There's a jealous and monolingual Savarna common sense that is now massified, electronic, and industrial. And not just that, the whole thing threatens to utterly change the nature of the Indian state, divest it not just of liberal pieties and principles, but make it withdraw totally from the liberal constitutionalism that Rammohun valued. I don't want to end with a Jeremiad, rather some speculative thoughts, that I would like to leave you with, and we can talk about that after, during the discussion. Today, many of us are searching to revitalize a critical discourse of the secular, which perhaps means to re-vernacularize the secular. That's not because the secular imagination today lacks reason or worldly alertness, but perhaps it is afflicted by disaffection in the age of electronic superstition. In its older forms, perhaps it has become what Hegel would call a cold universal, unable to respond to vernacular anxieties and questions about futurity, being or becoming. Rammohun Roy took advantage of the fact that the caste-divided and infinitely varied Hindu society did not have an axiomatic religious authority invested with historical power. He announced the dominant Brahmanism of his times itself as a Hindu heresy. Today, perhaps secularists should do something similar, but not on those exact terms. From touch points of life and language that are overwhelmingly identified as religious matters. This, I feel, is thus, the purpose I feel is not to stay away from the Ramayana, but once again proliferate secular readings of the many Ramayans, hundreds of them, and to do what in terms of immanent. To do that in terms of immanent vernacular emergence, the marshalling of class struggle and Ambedkarite, feminist, Kameen, and all other minoritarian energies, rather than from a commanding Anglophone anthropological heights. To combat religious bigotry of all kinds, secularists perhaps heresies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anustup. We'll now have Mo to comment. Mo, you'll have about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Datta, and thanks to Amita and Anustup for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. As always, Anustup, I learned so much from your work. It's so generative, it's so suggestive. And I know people are, more interested in listening to your ideas. So all I have for my discussion here are a series of questions. And if you take up any of them or some of them, I will learn more. And I guess our discussion will be further enriched. So without much further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and, talk about some of the things about, in your presentation that I found very, very rich and I would like to know more about. So all of us have our own Rammohuns, right? And 250 years into his life, into his work, there is a particular aspect of his character that is very, very attractive to me, which is that he instantly cuts through the arid minutiae of hair-splitting textual debates. And this comes from a wellspring of grief and of compassion, whose human empathy compels him to ask questions that echoes down the centuries to us. And this is something that is very, very apparent in your talk as well, Anustup, right? So it is this quality of extraordinary and liberal humanity, which is the foundation of his intellectual endeavors. It is exactly this quality that Rabindranath Tagore would pay homage to when he bestowed on Rammohun the honor of being an Indian pilgrim. He called Rammohun a true seeker of that submerged, liberal, all-embracing quality of compassionate rationality that was at the hidden core of the Indian way of life, and that sought the good of humanity beyond customary divisions based on religion, faith, community, and socioeconomic class. Rabindranath does something very interesting here. He calls Rammohun an Indian pilgrim, but at the same time uses an adjective taken from a verse in the Upanishads. He calls Rammohan's soul Vratyastamprana, a life that is outcast, separate, and thus free. And perhaps because it is an outcast, it is able to see more clearly beyond the daily rituals that blinded mere common men and women, and help them to see the deeper realities of spiritual conviction and courage. Having said that, I come to your talk and your idea of what Rammohun Roy's very powerful translational abilities do to the corpus of Hindu religious and sacred texts. So Partho Chatterjee in his Black Hole of Empire has called Rammohun's endeavors a very short-lived but powerful anti-absolutist formulation that was neither liberal nor democratic. He calls it a Creole configuration that demanded equality of races and religions. Anustup, that you point to this as well. And my question to you is this then: what does Rammohun Roy's modernity look like? What would be his definition of the secular, right? And what is it about his modernity and his idea of secularism that emerges so powerful in his translation activities? The second question is, of course, I'm a historian and counterfactuals are something that interest me in that way as well. You yourself use the term comprador with reference to Rammohun. This is not very far from the way in which, your starlet, Payal Rohtagi is her name, called Rammohun a stooge of the British, very, very insulting terms. It is his Anglophilia which is the target of the attack of the Hindu right, but not his services to the Mughal emperor. So what is it about Rammohun's apologia that is so powerfully provocative at this moment to the Indian Hindutva right? My third question comes, with your very interesting discussion of Schmidt and the powers of exception and the idea of bare life. Colonial Indians also lived a particular kind of bare life. We should not forget that the first Indian famine of 1771 rather occurs barely a year or two before Rammohun's own birth, and the memories of that essentially were alive in the Bengali mind for over a century and a half. How do you think this idea of the power of exception keeps working in the political theology of Rammohun himself, right? Is there a connection? Is there no connection? This idea of the stripping of every vestige of social and communal rights and privileges, and thinking of Indians as a vehicle or a vessel for both evangelical and colonial ideologies. Fourth question, and I have a number of them. I'll just go ahead and say all of them at once. You talk about the fraternity of a Hindu church, the impulse behind Hindutva, Hindutva 2.0, as you say in your book, to create a single church and an ecumenical fraternity. How does Rammohun's idea of Attiyo Shabha differ from this? The idea of a friend versus an enemy that you take from, Schmidt, the idea of jealousy, how is it powerfully countered in the very conception of the Brahmo Samaj, in the idea that every human being was each other's Attiyo, related to them through some ideological, moral, ethical precept? I would also like to ask you how you would define Rammohun's attempt at universal relationality as opposed to this particular kind of Schmittian jealousy, which is incorporated within this very fascistic bend towards thinking of Hinduism as monotheistic. The idea of, oh, my friends, there is no friend. How does that speak to the Hindu anxieties when Rammohun Roy's idea of a more equal, more ecumenical universe comes into play?
Mm-hmm.
There is a very interesting, segue somewhere in the middle of your paper where you talk about the civis and the polis and the idea of a civic monotheism as opposed to a political monotheism. I would just like to ask you to sort of place Rammohun in context with Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, whose Hinduism is very, very much that of political theology. And I would like to also ask you to chart, if possible, how these divergences occur from the 1820s to the 1870s, right? The question of translatability, the question of cosmopolitan and vernacular translatability brings up the idea of Walter Benjamin's, unconditional translatability of faith, right? Secondly, to juxtapose with it, there's experiments with translation and interpretation. I would like to bring about Professor Tanika Sarkar's idea that it's this very flexibility of translation, this idea that human translation could be fallible. And even then, there was some value attached to it, leads to later in the 19th century, in the 1880s and early 1890s, what she calls the inflexibility of interpretative reformism, that at a certain point, even this flexibility has to give away, because a certain text has to be given hierarchical, dominance over certain other kinds of texts. Mm-hmm. I'd like to kind of, again, ask you to sort of position Rammohun with this later trend in Bengal. In terms of, the Pauline figure in Indian Christianity, Shinjini Dash has a fantastic article where she writes of Paul as the imperial apostle. He becomes the figurehead of Indian Christian evangelical efforts. And again, the imperial context is contrasted to that of the Roman Mediterranean. So Rammohun's, idea of an ordering of Hinduism, if you will, and this Pauline ordering of Christianity, again, both have a bent towards state-making and even nation-making, if you will allow me to, say that. I'm just wondering what you think of this idea, that there is a state-making bent towards this reordering of religion. And if it is true in the case of Rammohun, what kind of state does he envision, right? Finally, I would like to talk about this very powerful idea of common sense and reason that you kind of contrast with civilizational shame and justice. And I'd like to kind of bring this question back to what Ranajit Guho called Rammohun's Doya, a word, in Bengali that has absolutely no immediate, accurate translation in English. The closest that I can come to it is a kind of compassionate rationality. And again, when we are talking about compassionate rationality, and we have to talk about civilizational reason, civilizational shame, and the move towards justice, I would like to kind of ask you where this compassionate rationality fits in with your own idea of what Rammohun is doing in his translation project. How does it fit in with the idea of disenchantment in the very, very strong and clearly articulated way in which Rammohun is essentially bringing the realm of the sacred to that of the moral and the ethical life? And I think he is the first Indian to do so. And I think it has profoundly important, effects on the ways in which we think about secularism in India at the current moment. And, the last question, of course, Rammohun Roy writes this, his most important work in 1817. You talk about the ethnographic anthropological bent towards his work. It has to be remembered that the ethnography of India, is also essentially a colonial impulse. Bernard Cohn talks about it. In 1817, one of the founders of the Serampur Baptist Church, William Ward, also writes an ethnographic account of Hindu religion and manners and modes of the Hindus, where again, in Hindu sacred texts, essentially, there is an effort towards a kind of Protestant, reform of Hinduism. And in many ways, Rammohun is answering back to that Protestant reform, the idea of Hinduism within that ambit of the Protestant reform. So both of them are indulging in this colonial practice of ethnography, one in order to encompass, the other in order to create something that is particularly Indian and not colonial. And I would just, I was just interested in hearing where you think these two practices of ethnography differ from each other, in what way Rammohun Roy differs from the people that he's answering back to when he is practicing very consciously this particular kind of colonial ethnography. Those are my questions. As always, this was an absolute pleasure to listen to you and, take up any of them, none of them, whatever you wish. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mo. Those are extremely they're great questions. So let me start with the one time I used the expression "canny comprador." Yes, I think it's quite clear that from Rammohun's writing that he does provisionally prefer English rule compared to the dispensations of the past, which included the Mughals as well as a figure like Ranjit Singh. But I always find a kind of a double register in whatever he's saying, especially pertaining to the possibility which he entertains that if the Europeans are allowed to settle, buy property and settle here, eventually there might be a time where, like as it happened in the United States, that the destinies of the two nations may part. And I find all his most of his writings to be representation in courts and juridical systems, and things like that. All of them are strategic, polemical, and there is a certain tone to them. But at the same time, he was. It's difficult to believe that he didn't know what was actually happening. And why the rule of property, for instance, the right to property, is extended to zamindars and not to peasants. He knew that very well. But at the same time, and he was talking about, arguing for the freedom of press, knowing full well that there is, in effect, there's no such freedom. And, it would be sort of naive and idealistic to expect that in full measure. So what one does is polemicize and expect a few concessions. So that is there. I think a certain creolization is, especially in relation to Partha that talks about it. Rammohun's obsession with France, the letter asking for a visa, a passport, to be allowed to visit France is very indicative. So there is a kind of a creolization in what was being was in a space which was not yet a public sphere in the classical sense. It wasn't a civil society. It was some sort of an affective universe that was coming together. And Rammohun was actually, while he was writing, he was one of its architects, right? So in that sense, I think there was, I feel that he was working through a lot of historical possibilities, and maybe towards an idea of the state and governance. That is, that there are exciting templates, European templates, that one can obviously think of, but with the knowledge that they are not applicable in a certain historical setting. And, you know, if one has to, and as it is, you know, it's there in the European tradition itself, that you come to the modern state through, via the establishment of a certain civic religiosity, which can then be parlayed into. Now, in Rammohun's case, I'm sure it was a concern for him that in the Indian context, what exactly would that civic religiosity be? One that is not fierce, jealous, sectarian, and one that can sort of climb over the clamor that you know that is there. And I think his thinking was the result, and his political thinking was the result of that, you know, this desire to address that clamor. And he could only, you know, think about, in that sense, he could think about the whole thing in terms of creolization and in terms of new institutions. Hence his very deep interest in education. Hence his deep interest in the abiding presence of the Christian footprint, as well as Enlightenment education and Baconian sciences in the Indian context. Okay, let me see. Interestingly, whenever I think of you know, Rammohun and Bankim, I think of Rashlila. So this is something that you know, Rammohun obviously doesn't like at all. Doesn't like at all, primarily because they popularize the kind of myths and you know, irrational devotion that he doesn't like. Bankim, I think, you know, realizes two things, being a person of his times. One is that, and I refer to that very slightly in the book. One is that Rammohun's project is too intellectual, too esoteric, too you know, too high up there to sort of historically motivate the masses, right? It doesn't have affective purchase. That actually comes with rituals, that comes with idolatry and a lot of other things. So it is, you know, again, to recall that Hegelian term I used was that it's a cold universal. Now, Bankim also doesn't like Rashlila, essentially, but at the same time, he understands that for his vision of India to come into you know, into fruition, sort of one needs, along with axiomatic institutions like the Hindu college, we need other things which today we would call popular culture. Hence Rashlila, hence these, you know, his thoughts about finding ways to you know, to execute a kind of a ritualistic mobilization and invention of Hindu community through shared ceremonies, shared Raslila, and you know, and popular theatrical and musical forms, right? And if you contrast that with Brahmo Sangit, it becomes quite clear which way the two are heading. The thing about Paul, yes. Well, this I think I forgot to say, but I should. it's not that Rammohun is very much impressed with Pauline Christianity either. I mean, his whole point is that it created those early Greek, Greek and Roman converts, and built its own cult of idolatry, right? And he's very scathing when it comes to that, right? The critique of Trinitarianism. And especially find that essay, I haven't read that in a while, where 3 Chinese converts talk about gods are there. And he says 3. And the other one, I think, says 2. And 2 because there was 3, but Jesus was killed. So it came down to 2. And so it's pretty scathing and pretty consistent as far as Rammohun is concerned. And so in that sense, the way he deflects, the question, especially, in the exchange with Reverend War, it is quite clear that it's not, he is not looking at a scenario where the Pauline apparatus should just come and take over, rationalize, order, editorialize and take over. That much, and so in that sense, Shinjini is absolutely correct. I mean, Paul, in that sense, is an imperial figure. And when Rammohun says, and later, echoed by Keshav Chandra Datta, that Christ has to come in a completely different Indian incarnation, absolved of all that miraculous, all those magical qualities and stuff like that. So, and you had a question about Doya. Yes, I find that, really something very intriguing. That it's actually a fundamental human compassion that sort of motivates a person to take up this work. And what is also remarkable is that he is ready to go great lengths. I forget, I think his father's, he was Vaishnava on the father's side and a Shakta on the mother's, right? So managed to, disappoint and anger both sides of the family. Someone who was a beneficiary of the order, but at the same time worried about the peasants. Someone who was a beneficiary of the caste system, but declared that it was because of the caste system that Indians will never be pure, patriotic in a good sense. These things
again, I'm sorry to intervene, but we are running short of time.
Oh, sorry.
And if you could just wrap this up with a response, a little with a sentence or two, because there's so many other questions I'm sure that will come up from the floor, and we don't really have much time to actually take this on. Mo's has been incredibly comprehensive, and most of the important questions have been covered by her, but still there may be many others also. So I'm sorry. Please finish. I'm sorry.
No, I'm actually done for now. We can come back to these things later. We could go to some of the questions, maybe.
May I ask something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Even though you say that Mo has asked all the questions, I have a couple of very minor queries from both to put to both Mo and Anustup. And thank you both for very, very interesting presentations. Anustup, I was thinking of the tracts on Sati, and I won't say very much because I have already written so much about them. But you know, in the two tracts, I don't think he ever invokes the one at all. And that I find very interesting, that he is not addressing Shruti or the problem of Shruti from the point of what shall I say, religious justice, or from a superior religious vantage point. And in that connection, Mo, I would, you know, like to point out that Rammohun did not abandon the terrain of hair-splitting, abstruse, extremely abstruse scholastic arguments. He engaged with that, and he outdid the orthodox pundits in his abstruseness and in his scholasticism, employing the Navyanaya tactics to great effect. And he had to do that for a reason. To both of you, and this is a conversation that Amit Urmila will remember, that the first talk, after the first talk by Rahul, or the discussion by Rahul, we all had Partho, Rudrangshu, I, and Rahul and several others. I am a little surprised that you think Doya has no English equivalent. And must compassion in English be compassionate rationality? And I would suggest, and I have written about this, that Rammohun's second tract of Sati, on Sati, he comes to Daya. Absolutely the last line of the last passage. Otherwise, it's even the last passage, which is really the, you know, it still gives me goosebumps. That last passage is built on the first, I have called it the first ethnographic text from an Indian. Very close, detailed observations of every woman's everyday life. Okay, so that might be one of the you know, sources of the new ethnography that Rammohun is introducing, and which some British officials, I must admit, do engage in during the whole Sati debate, especially Walter Ewer and sometimes several others, but it's not that it's absent. But also the colonial ethnography in its finished sense does come much later, from the mid-19th century. At this point, the colonial state is very much a scriptural text-based state. Anustup, may I have those references to the BJP's comments on Shruti and, you know, that you began with?
Yes.
So, you know,
they're actually quite easy to find.
Yes, I saw a few, but this was much more telling. And I'll come back if I have time, but let me ask.
If we could take another couple of questions, I think we'll have to wind up at 8 o'clock, if I'm not wrong. Amit Babu?
So, but we can always
say another run over by another 10, 15 minutes.
Seeing the audience, so maybe we can decide accordingly.
So can we have another couple of questions and then, you know, Anustup, you could respond to all three then together. Go ahead, whoever. If there isn't, could you then respond to Tonika, please?
I think I'll just, you know, quickly respond to the first question, and then Mo should, respond. Yes, Tonikadi, I actually didn't think of that, and thanks for reminding me. I didn't think of that when I was writing it. Now that you tell me, yes, it is very interesting that he doesn't talk about the one while he's talking about Shruti. And there he is marshalling texts following quite well for a polemical purpose. And the engagement is according to the rules set by the enemy itself. And according to those rules, yes, there is a lot of, there are contradictions, but there, Monu is his friend. And Monu can be mobilized to, even Krishna can be mobilized to deflect or cancel arguments that are based on other scriptures. So there he is very much willing to get his hands dirty and work according to a certain hierarchical imagination of the texts themselves and collide them against each other. Mo, would you like to step in?
Yes, absolutely. Tonikadi, thank you so much for those, corrections. Your work on Sati and your work on Rammohun Roy is the foundational text, I think, that every student of history has to study. And I think you were completely right when you say that Rammohun has to engage with the hair splitting, because that is the terrain on which he can actually answer back and find a solution to the problem of sati in and of itself. What I meant to say, and perhaps I should have been more nuanced while I was, asking Anustup, that the question is, beyond that textual exercise, there is a particular kind of humanism, which again, you yourself, refer to in your work, and I learned it from you, which goes beyond this textual debate and hits at something that no one before has considered, which is the humanity of Indian women. And it is the humanity of Indian women which evokes this particular kind of daya, this particular kind of compassion. Does it always have to be rational? No, of course not. Daya is something that is instinctive, and in a way, it's a particular essential ingredient of the moral and ethical life that Rammohun Roy, I think, in a way, starts theorizing about from this particular point. But at the same time, the way in which he goes through the first and the second conversations, the way in which he builds his case from the hair splitting to that absolutely heart-rending last sentence of the last paragraph, as you call it, "Taha dekhiya tomader doyar uddrek hoy na." It is a rhetoric tour de force. In a sense, it is rationally constructed as a particular forceful and justificatory apologia, the kind of which has not been seen in India ever before, especially certainly not regarding women's rights. I take your corrections completely to heart, and I think you're absolutely correct, and I'll endeavor to be more nuanced from now on. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was also thinking that, years ago, when I was first reading these Sati pamphlets, there was a time, after the first few pages, I began to think, so are we getting to a position where he will be, because he's stuck with these texts, he will be compelled to say that, well, it should be forced deaths of that kind, or ritualistic murder should be banned. But if a woman just wants to commit sati, we will have nothing to say about that. But that was still one, one came to the this category that comes in to precisely to take it, beyond that. And that is where I think the text reaches a completely different level. Anyways, I thought of just adding that.
Are there any other questions? I'll just pop in one or two, since there's nobody else who's venturing, and maybe they'll. I'll just, just going back to the sati thing, there seems to be a figure of the human over there that is, very important. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about the kind of conception of the human in Rammohun, and how this kind of idea of a human with shared affectivity, as well as a kind of assumption of freedom and compassion, but also, on one hand, consolidating the sharedness through compassion, but also through anger. I think that's pretty important as well. So there is a kind of affective aspect which has been just brought out very well by many of the interlocutors. And how does this kind of work with the notion of the human as divided by differential capacities in his notion of idol worship and so on and so forth? So that was one question that I had, and I'm intrigued by that, because the implications may be a little different and looking to different directions. The other one, which I thought was an interesting tension also, is this kind of figure of the historical Muslim. And as you've argued in your book, the Muslim is one of the differentiating figures of the new kind of genealogy of Hindu that leads to the Hindutva, and that particular trajectory of the Hindu. And you did mention in your observations about the historical figure of the Muslim. But it's also interesting that I think when he talks about cultivators, etc., he talks in very different ways about the Muslim in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And, and what happens to these two kind of split understanding of the Muslim as a historical figure and as a contemporary figure? So if you have some...
May I just ask if he talks about the Muslim peasant particularly? Where does he do that?
If I remember correctly, there are some references to Muslims in the peasant. I think there's reference to Muslim peasants who are superior in terms of accumulation than the Hindu peasants. If I remember correctly, there is a passage to that effect.
The other thing that I remember is he does, in his deposition to the, I think, 1831 depositions, he does say that the Muslim lawyers are much more respected and trusted than...
Sure. Yeah, they're more honest and that sort of stuff.
Yes. So I actually, I don't know. I can't, talk about this past and present distinction too much. I haven't thought about that. So I, pick it up. If you could enlighten me. But yes, it is something to think about. And in terms of the humanism, which we are almost, all compelled to, think about. And if we think about that historical moment itself, let's say roughly from 1800 to 1831, 1833, and the way humanism was being articulated in Europe. And, so one figure who sort of, who's there in Europe while this is going on in, in Rammohun's career is obviously Hegel. And we think about his gradations of humanity. The obvious question, obviously, is the clear question is, how does race factor into it, and gender? Right. And so from Hegel to, let's even John Stuart Mill, you just go through the figures. What is the consensus view of imperial Europe? We are humans, but some humans are more human than other humans. And some humans are infantile humans. Some humans are subhumans. And some humans can become humans, but only through, colonial tutelage or something like that. It had to be slavery for Africans because every man was a sorcerer, right? So if we think of those gradations, and if we think of what Rammohun says while addressing a Brahminical patriarchy, that women are just by nature prone to sensuous pleasure, and they can't be trusted. Well, first of all, he says that it's rich, coming from, Kulin Brahmins who marry dozens of times. And secondly, you are the people who have just denied any kind of intellectual life and education to women. And so when he's talking about that in that particular age, I think it's remarkable. So when we talk about humanism as an ideology, as an intellectual horizon, so in that early moment, when the general consensus was that there is a humanism, there's a humanity, but obviously it's hierarchical, it's largely to be naturally dominated by white men of property. And there are entities who cannot be imagined to be part of that now or even in a future date. And women would be that part of that group. And when Rammohun sort of polemicizes on those grounds, that women are agents, they have intellectual abilities, and if you're not letting them contemplate the one, you are denying them eternal beatitude, which they deserve. By it's kind of a default argument that so that is what I find remarkable.
Thanks, Anustup. Are there any other questions, suggestions, comments?
Can I just very quickly, to your question about the present and the historical Muslim, Professor Datta, it's always struck me as very, very interesting that it's Rammohun's Anglophilia which is the target of so much hate from the Hindutva brigade. Somehow they have forgotten that the last part of his life was spent in the service of the Mughal emperor, and the fact that his last companion was a Muslim woman, and the son that he loves and takes with him to England is a product of that union. It has always been very surprising to me, because in every other sense, the bent of right-wing, Hindu, conversation on history has been so focused on the Muslim, the historical Muslim and the contemporary Muslim, that when it comes to Rammohun, somehow that there is this very big blind spot. But, thank God for that, I guess, because we don't want to get into more horrible, whatever it is.
Thanks, Mo. it may also well be because of the intellectual challenge that Roy poses in a certain sense, which they then wish to designate as Western and colonial and so on and so forth, which is a divorce, making a kind of distinction with the physical presence of the Muslim and the, and the kind of biological sort of fear.
PK?
Yeah.
It could also be more, I was just wondering, it hadn't struck me before you spoke, but it could also be because Rammohun does say a few things which are very close to the perennial theme of Muslim tyranny. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, all empires are tyrannical.
Yes.
And he was very scared of absolutism, tyranny, whether it's of the British or he chastised the British whenever he thought that they were approaching that. They always were, but so I think that might have made them overlook that little part of his but it's very ominous, Anustup, that they are talking about Shruti in bringing up Shruti and they want to go with that. It's,
yes, well, the year before that, the target was Bidashagar, who desecrated his bust, and sort of walked back their talk when they realized that this was a political error. But so with Rammohun, the party was pretty silent, but the mediaverse was, it was quite clear which way things are heading.
Thanks very much. I suspect there are many more surprises for us in store in terms of the targets of attack. But thanks, Anustup, really very much, and Mo, for this very, very comprehensive and powerful discussion. And Anustup, especially to also bring this and brush this against the present, our present today, and actually make Roy's understanding of Roy a political act. So thank you very much, and for, of course, the very many rich insights. And thanks to everybody. And I'll hand over the session to Amit Babu, so that if he has any announcements or whatever to make.
Yeah, thank you, Pikeda. Thank you for holding the show, and special thanks to Anustup and Mo for this wonderful discourse. In fact, we wish we had a bigger audience, because the messages that came out from this was really something which we should take back and think. We should really think on these messages. So thank you once again, and thank you to the audience who has been patiently with us and has stayed with us throughout the entire thing. So thank you once again. This will be available on YouTube. I will be putting this straight away after this session. So those who had missed it will be able to join. And as you know, we have our sessions every month. So next month, we'll be announcing the topic and the people who will be speaking and the discussant. And we also plan to have a sort of a conference in May this year, around about 27 and 28. So more on that. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day or your evening, whatever it might be. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.